Yes, Comrade Chair.
Okay. All right. No, thank you so much, comrades, and welcome, comrades, to our reconvened meeting. Last week, we had a meeting and we agreed to postpone the meeting for today on the basis that, one, attendance it was not that good, and we felt that perhaps it could have been the time that we chose to convene. It was around 4 or 3. I cannot recall the time very well. And we also agreed that we rather at least accommodate those who are still traveling from work to home and even to from other activities as well. Hence, we've decided on the 18 hours. The agenda is posted on the chat, comrade. We are now dealing with the first agenda item, which is welcome and an objective. I'm going to deal with that shortly. And then we are going to allow Comrade Charles just to take us through the credentials. And we're also going to, that's the purpose of today's session in the main, to deal with the approach to the 2024 national elections, the tactic and the campaign. We are going to allow Comrade Awande and Comrade Vish to take us through that item. And after that, we are going to allow discussions and agree on the way forward. Comrade Vish and Comrade Lydia will just take us through that item as well. Comrades, just briefly, the purpose of today's session is to allow the discussion that ensued in our launching conference of what should be our attitude in our in the 2024 national elections. The conference agreed that we need to convene the national platform where comrades are going to have an opportunity to reflect as to what should be the attitude of the CJCM in relation to that. There's a discussion document that we prepared. Comrade Awande and Comrade Vish are going to take us through that. So we felt that we need to democratize that item as possible as we can, so that when we move, we should be moving in unison when approaching the 2024 national elections. I think there are quite a number of developments that are taking place in the space where we are operating, and we feel that we cannot, I think in the past we did a lot of work in terms of advocacy. So we are of the view that we need to make it a point that we are also participating in those national elections. But hence we said we need to have a session where all parties, all organizations that have signed up in our CJCM will have a view as to what should be our approach. So in the main, comrades, that's the purpose of today's session. Without any waste of time, comrades, I'm going to allow Comrade Charles just to take us through who's here and what are the apologies, Comrade. Comrade Charles?
Thank you, Comrade Ruth. In terms of confirmations, we now have 53 confirmations. There are no apologies. In terms of credentials, Comrade Chair, I've been going through the registrations as people were signing up for the webinar, double checking the organizations that are being represented and the people present. And so I think in terms of credentials, we are in order, Comrade Chair. I believe that if we were to go through every person who is in attendance to identify themselves, it wouldn't really serve the best interest, because people are not going to join at the same time. Others are going to join later while presentations are ongoing. So I have been keeping a close watch on the registrations. I have the back end access to the Zoom. So from my side, Comrade Chair, the registrations are in order, and therefore the participants are in order as well, meaning the credentials are fit for the meeting.
Okay. That is that. From the credentials, comrades. Can we perhaps get the mover, comrade, in relation to the credentials? Or is there anyone who's having a contrary view, comrades, in relation to what has been presented? Or a comment, comrade? I guess there's none. So meaning that comrades are in agreement that we can move over to the next agenda item. We are now moving over to the approach to the 2024 national elections, the tactics and the campaign. Comrade
Apologies, Comrade Chair. Apologies,
sorry.
Comrade Chair. There's a hand from Comrade Rashida.
Okay, comrade, I can't see hands. Oh, Comrade Rashida. Unmute yourself, my leader. Comrade Rashida.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to approve and move on to the points of agenda, but I do know that the apologies hasn't been made yet. Thank you. So I support that we move ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, my leader. The next agenda item, Comrade Vish and Comrade Awande.
Comrade Awande, you'll start with the tactic document.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone who's here today to join us. And we also have a number of different faces from those who were with us at our October conference and those who weren't. So for the benefit also of everyone in the space, just so that we can have a proper informed discussion, I'll begin with some background before going into a strategic approach and thinking, and then passing over to Vish. So with regards to the background, everyone here is familiar with the fact that the work of the Climate Justice Charter movement precedes this moment of the movement's existence. It begins with the work of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign from the drought of the previous decade into this decade. And then coming out of that was the creation and formation of the Charter, its vision, and its strategic approach to addressing the legacies of the apartheid era and the current party crisis that we face right now. And out of this and formation of the Charter and the work that came from the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, the Charter was endorsed by 282 organizations and still continues to grow. And in that journey and that movement from the work that COPAC and the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign did, subsequently with the Climate Justice Charter movement, we've seen a number of attempts to engage with the government and political parties, around ways of securing commitments to place this country on a democratic climate emergency footing, to raise the alarm, consciousness, and decisive ways of dealing with the party crisis that is continuing to worsen under the failed ANC leadership, which I think everyone in attendance today is aware of. And in addition to that, if you see from the work of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign in 2015, hosting Hunger Tribunal to address the worsening food crisis at the time. In 2016, the Drought Speak Out and Bread March that were held. In 2018, taking the People's Food Sovereignty Act to Parliament. These are all examples of this work in trying to engage with the government and bring this matter to the public. 2018 being a special year because that's when the UN IPCC report on 1.5 degrees comes out. And with that, there was a decisive call that emissions must be reduced by 45% globally by 2030. So we also called on the president to convene an emergency sitting of parliament to discuss what this means for our country's preparedness. This is all the way in 2018, and we sit in a special moment right now of the focus on COP28 now also happening. So there's time that all of these things have come to the fore, all of these engagements with the government were being sought, and time which has also been lost in the work that we're trying to achieve. In 2019, the Charter was developed through the various bottom-up dialogues that took place. In 2020, on October 16th, on World Food Day, there was the engagement held with Parliament for them to adopt the charter. We also took the document with crafted by leading climate scientists, a memorandum warning about the climate risks that the country is facing, and also ways in which we're demanding for them to act to end climate harm for communities, corruption, thirst, pollution, and hunger. In 2021, we went back to Parliament. We returned to Parliament with the fire engine outside of Parliament in Cape Town to emphasize this challenge of a planet and a heating planetary environment. And we once again challenged and demanded that Parliament must adopt the Charter. In 2022, we charged the President and others in his government for the deaths that were caused due to the climate-related rain bomb in KZN. And this climate disaster was also something which we've attributed and see as a result of their failed leadership. Our criminal justice system also was put to the test, and it failed to be able to meet the demands and the challenge of the criminal charges that we laid. This year, we celebrated the 3rd-year anniversary of the Climate Justice Charter on October 28th, and we once again continue to call on the President to place the country on a democratic climate emergency footing, given the forecasts that scientists have put forward with regards to our preparedness, our failed preparedness for the worst that is to come. So these are all examples of the work that we have done as a movement, the work that we've done also to engage our governments, the work that we've done to also make them aware of and to try communicate with them with regards to putting this country on a climate emergency footing, and really putting us in a good position rather to be able to handle this worsening public crisis in a way that not only lessens the suffering that is felt today, but will greatly reduce the suffering that we will continue to see as time moves forward. But as we've seen, the ANC government and the mainstream political parties in this country have ignored us, and they've ignored the work of our activism. But with regards to that, we still cannot sit back and be victims of a failed political leadership. We can't sit back and hang our heads in disappointment because they failed to act. The country requires to be put on a democratic climate emergency footing. The democratic climate emergency perspective also needs to be mainstreamed so that the entire country can, really come into action in taking forward this task of accelerating the deep just transition in communities, workplaces, and sectors, as we've continued to call for. And also to help us meet the needs of people and affirm our international climate commitments as well. So our strategic approach with this background and this context taken into consideration, previously in our March 2023 conference this year, we drew the following strategic conclusions about the state and of climate politics and climate struggle, that the UN-led multilateral process, including the Paris Agreement, is failing human and non-human life, and that there's a crisis of leadership at this level, including within most national states. I think if anyone has been following what's been happening at the COP process this year, I mean, just the fact that it was hosted in the UAE and it's being headed by people with conflicting interests, to say the least, who've also outwardly spoken against the science that necessitates those processes, it's become a sham. I fail to find the words to accurately describe what this process means and its ability to actually deal in protecting human and non-human life. Fossil fuel capital has also found its way to, has embedded itself in these processes, but it's also effectively delayed the phase out of fossil fuels. The global energy mix is being skewed towards fossil fuels still. Recent geopolitical crises over the past 2 years, such as the war in Ukraine, have also accelerated some of the ways in which fossil capital has been able to embed itself in slowing down this shift, particularly in places such as Europe. And also countries such as ourselves in the developing world have seen an opportunity to, sort out its developmental goals by trying to exploit this shift that has occurred. There's been a failure to address this crisis for 3 decades now, and it's also politically put us on course for an eco-fascist course towards the way in which climate chaos and climate breakdown is going to play out. So you are seeing this great harm which will occur and the loss of life becoming a lived reality, not just in the way in which it's playing out in the physical sense due to lack of inaction and failed political leadership, but also due to the way in which these set of circumstances are also going to change the way in which politics is going to take place globally, but in our country also. South Africa, you've seen it already, and we've seen the beginnings of it, but we've also seen the ways in which it's going to shift. We've seen the carbon nationalist side of the ANC with Minister Mantashe and others vehemently and staunchly, calling out climate justice activism as unpatriotic ways of trying to sabotage our country. And then you've also seen within the same party and the same political leadership, the Green Neoliberal faction, which you've seen in the Presidential Climate Commission, which has also tried to seek this opportunity as a way for capital and others to make profits, not as a means of putting the country on a climate emergency footing to limit harm to human and non-human life. So with these political shifts also, you're seeing the failures change also in the ways in which we're approaching the worsening climate crisis and delaying this acceleration of the deep just transition. So South Africa is unprepared, to say the least. Sorry, there's something. So South Africa is unprepared, to say the least. And this decade and the decades to come, or the years to come rather, will be, particularly marked by all of these worsening crises exacerbated and implemented by the climate crisis. We've seen it beginning with the rain bombs from 2019 to last year, the flooding that's going to continue, the storm surges that are going to continue, the prospects of the extreme summer heat and dry conditions that we're currently moving into. I think everyone is familiar or has experienced what was called, the heat waves of the past month or so, but just the conditions that we're moving to as we move into the summer months. And these obviously spell disaster, but also, have their own ramifications for how this country is going to be able to survive and cope at the level of the states, which has been falling apart, but also spells economic disaster, to say the least. So our country, it is clear and evident that we're currently in this polycrisis of social reproduction, which is going to be exacerbated by this inability for us to mainstream, but also to accelerate and deepen, accelerate the deep just transition. And on top of this, we also have to contest with the ANC government's market democracy, the way in which they've tried to manage this country. It's been exclusionary. It's had an emphasis on, giving power to capital over the state, society, and national relations. And in addition to this, across different administrations of ANC leadership, most recently, we saw the Zoomification of our constitutional democracy, which also compromised and intensified and further criminalized our state. So you've seen a rollback of constitutional democracy also occurring at the same time as all these other things that we've been contending with as a country. And with this rollback and this criminalized market democracy really, expanding in the current administration of our current president, you can see that the trajectory in which they put us on is not working. And we're veering more and more towards a dangerous place where the options for us to be able to act and for us to be able to put our country in a position that it's able to deal with these crises, these options and spaces of availability become less and less. So political parties in this country evidently also have become transactional. They've also become criminalized and performative while this has happened. And the voting public has become indifferent, and also their ability to partake in our democracy has also been lessened merely just to play the role of voting. And that's what happens between elections, and then there's nothing else left for them to be able to assert themselves in a democratic space. So once we're seeing this happening, of this shift in our politics also, we're also seeing, on the other hand, this widespread state failure that is creeping at the same rate as the spread and the growth of dysfunction within our criminalized market democracy. So these are the things that we're contending with that are putting a serious limitation in our ability to put forward serious solutions to addressing the worsening part of the crisis. So this has created a crisis of political representation and a deepening crisis of legitimacy within the states that needs to be contended with. And for any serious activists, and particularly climate justice activists, how then, generally, seriously, as we think about the next 5 years between this coming election and the next election, what space, what rooms, what avenues are left then for us to engage with a state without taking seriously the question of politics? What are the other routes that are available to us, if not this? And it's also important to state that the Climate Justice Charter movement is not a political party, but we have been pushing a climate justice project for the country, which is important for us to take into consideration that we come with a plurivision that's in the form of the charter. We've had 4 strategies to confront the poly crisis by building an international bloc of vulnerable governments, people, workers, and movements. We're securing a climate justice deal and seeking a climate justice deal and people or worker-driven democratic climate emergency state. We're also pushing for deepening democracy through fighting corruption and renewing our constitutional democratic project. And we're also building a people and worker-driven movement that is grounded in this new paradigm and aspects with regards to power that builds and transforms and shifts to accelerate the deep just transition in communities, workplaces, and sectors, and the state also. So we have perspectives with regards to how to confront this crisis. We have perspectives with regards to how the states also should be shaped and repositioned to be able to deal with this. And as a people and worker-driven movement, we also believe in transformation that must be grounded in the political program of transformative policy. So we have a solid foundation with regards to the solutions and avenues through which we can address this crisis. We've provided content for deep just transition and will continue to do so also in a way that must be fought from below for these democratic systemic reforms. So this electoral tactic that we're speaking about today is a way of us expressing a tactical flexibility with how we can take these CJCM strategies and our political program and perspectives into the democratic mainstream. It's a way for us to position ourselves, our perspective, our work, and our vision into the political mainstream of this country. It's also about us seeking ways of testing things such as a movement party function, so that the CJCM can be positioned in a way that it helps confront this crisis of political leadership, so that we can face this worsening poly crisis and put our country on a democratic climate emergency footing, which helps capacitate the state, society, and the economy to face the worsening poly crisis. So from this point, then I'll hand over to you, Comrade Vish.
Comrade Vish?
Thank you, Wande. So I'm just going to use some slides. So, comrades, as Wande has been saying, it's been a journey for us. Sort of almost 3 years of advocacy and development of the charter, taking us into 2021, when we realized that this is an unresponsive state. It's not a caring state. And there's a back history to this, as he mentioned. It's not serious about putting the country on a climate emergency footing, which it needs to be based on science. We also recognized that we needed to clarify what kind of movement are we. Everybody wants to be a movement. We use that word so loosely these days, it's almost meaningless. But for us, we were very clear that we had to ground what we are doing. And so we went into a serious process of clarification. And we're very clear that we are an anti-party movement, but we are also, as Awande has been saying, a movement about strategic politics. Because of the scale of the crisis and the depth of the crisis, we cannot approach this just in terms of symbolic politics, just in terms of lobbying, just in terms of kind of going to COP summits, etc. We really need to think about how do we change the direction of the country before it's too late. And so we've been clarifying our strategies and our strategic politics, and we've reached conclusions that Awande has said. We've had a conference also we had a workshop in September of 2022. We had a conference in March of this year, and we had a conference again in October this year, clarifying who we are as a strategic, transformative anti-party movement. I think the second point to make is that, yes, we've been trying to place climate on the agenda of communities, in workplaces, and that's why we have about 284 organizations that endorsed the charter, symbolically them realizing that this is a serious problem. They want to own that problem, and they believe in the solutions to that problem. But we also want to place climate on the agenda of all the other important institutions in our society. And we need this breakthrough. We need to place the climate crisis at the heart of our society. So that's another kind of big consideration around where we've come to. So we are not electoralist. And I think it's very important to underline this point. We are a movement that is facing an unprecedented challenge facing humanity. And we are trying to think about how to break through. This is our big dilemma. And that means we can't think in old formulas, and we can't think in very either-or kinds of ways. We've got to navigate a very complex situation. Now, when you look at the science, South Africa is in 2034 most likely going to have a 3 degrees Celsius reality. The world will overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius, given the failure of the multilateral process. And that means this election is actually our 2034 moment. It means that if we don't step in front of this problem now, if we don't get ahead of this problem now, with a country that's in crisis, a state falling apart, a ruling elite just avaricious and greedy and looting, we are going to be walking into a serious nightmare. And it has begun. And many of you have lived now climate crisis. You've lived the drought. You've lived the storm surge. You've lived the heat waves, and so on and so on. So this is not an academic thing. This is very, very real. So Awande has underlined the rationales for why we are considering this as an anti-party movement to mainstream the climate emergency. It's all about ensuring that we confront the unjust transition unfolding in South Africa at the moment. There's nobody in this parliament, and there's none of these newcomers that are on the landscape that are willing to kind of place these issues front and center with the depth and the coherence and the clarity of where we need to go to achieve a just transition. We also have two choices right now in South Africa, given the degeneration of politics. It's either exclusionary nationalism on the one hand with its different shades, whether it's the EFF, whether it's Operation Dudula, whether it's rising Christian fundamentalist parties, etc., and the white right. On the other extreme, we have market liberals who basically are just giving us the same jaded formulas, which have not worked for almost 3 decades. So we really are facing an election that could consolidate a further shift to the right, which is in step with what's happening globally, by the way. The US is likely to move further to the right. Europe next year in June is having its election, and all the polls are saying the right-wing parties are going to be the beneficiaries of that election. And you've already had some serious neo-fascist right-wing forces come to power in other parts of the world, like India. Next year, the BJP is likely to win. So you have this dramatic shift to the right going on in our planet. And of course, in our country, our democracy is moving in the same direction. As an anti-party movement committed to a transformative politics, we want to try and demonstrate that you can have a societal-driven politics. You can take parliament and you can place parliament in active dialogue with society, to learn from society, to co-create with society, so that political representation is not about leaders at the top and led at the bottom, rulers and subjects. No, we need to break that mold of politics, given the nature of the crisis we are facing. We are facing a post normal crisis, okay? A crisis that is so complex and so big, everybody's got to be seized with it. And so for us, the politics around Parliament is getting our most important institution to basically make that connection with society. And that connection hasn't been made yet. To engage with deep democracy. We never had a constitutional democracy in South Africa. We had elements of it. And we've largely constitutionalized a market democracy. We've voted, and then, of course, the ANC just listens to the World Bank, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, and so on. That's a market democracy. Inordinate power given to capital over citizens, over our constitution. We need to place the constitution back at the center of politics as part of a transformative engagement. So the way we've been thinking, and I'm speaking to a second document, which we're not making public, we have deliberated on it extensively. Our National Coordinating Committee has met twice, and it has now shaped some of this. And this is answering questions that we had at our conference in October. Various questions were asked about, well, how do you position, what kind of campaign we can have, what kind of grassroots activism is required, etc., etc. So this is the kind of deeper thinking we've been doing around, well, what would a campaign look like? And basically, we want this to be a class and popular struggle-driven approach to the elections. There are key flashpoints across our society, and many of our endorsing organizations, many of our activists are sitting in the middle of many of these struggles. This weekend on Saturday, there'll be over 20 coast-to-coast protest actions against oil and gas. And many of our activists are integrally involved with this. And we are supporting it as best as we can, also as the Climate Justice Charter movement. There's a climate-conscious public there, which I'll come back to. There's hunger issues, and we've been working on the hunger front for almost a decade. Next year, the South African Food 70 campaign will be 10 years old. We have activists working in different communities around this issue. We have activists working with water-stressed communities. There are activists resisting car power ships, corruption, etc. So there are major flashpoints in our society, cutting across our society, and we need to express that. And our platform, our policies, the charter expresses a way forward vis-a-vis these struggles. There are major constituencies in struggle. I mentioned the climate conscious public. In a recent Ipsos poll going into the COP summit, they did a survey in 33 countries on the planet. South Africa was one of them. And this is the latest data we've been able to get. 63% of South Africans expect climate harm in the next 10 years. Again, this is an indicator that there is a climate conscious public in South Africa because people have been living the climate crisis. And we need to think about, how do we place the climate emergency on the ballot? This is the tactic we are grappling with. How can we test this climate consciousness in our society? Unemployed youth are a constituency in a permanent crisis of social reproduction. And again, we need to be able to articulate and resonate with their concerns. Workers are getting squeezed in a failing economy. And again, we need to find the intersections. Informal traders, we've worked with very closely. Comrade Rashida is here tonight. She's at the intersection of thousands of informal traders in this country. We've worked with small-scale fishers, children, particularly the ones that came out of Fridays for Future, are active in the Climate Justice Charter movement. Spatial targeting is the third leg on which we want to target this campaign. And essentially, we're not talking about a campaign with a footprint across the country. We can't. Again, it's got to be very targeted, very focused. And the metros are where the battlegrounds are. It's where the voting densities are. It's where the shifts have been happening away from the ruling party. It's where the fluidity lies. And of course, even in those metros, it's not about going everywhere. It's targeting arterial roads, public spaces, etc., so that you're able to place our presence in the public arena. There are communities in which we are rooted because we've been working with them for a long time. And so we have very grounded activists that can rally those communities. There are mining affected communities, and there's also students at universities. We now have about 3 student-based structures on campuses. Students are very climate conscious. Wits University had a course on induction last year. 7,000 students went to that course. So the charter, as Awande has been saying, gives us this plurivision. So we're not just tree huggers in the derogatory sense. We want to address the legacies of apartheid. We want to confront the current poly-crisis and secure a just, livable, and democratic future. This is the lodestar of what we stand for in South Africa. We also recognize that it's not just the climate crisis that we are up against. It's intersecting poly-crises. It's a crisis that's gridlocking life on many, many fronts. We also recognize that climate justice is not narrowly social justice. It is also interspecies or non-human life justice as well that we are fighting for. I've also alluded to the fact that this is a post-normal problem, which means it can't be routinized in commissions and in a ministry and just in a government. This problem, because it threatens everything and all of us, has to be owned by all of us, and its solutions have to be owned by all of us. And that's what the charter gives us. And most importantly, it has to be people and worker driven. So in terms of how to position around the election, one of the slogans we've come up with to capture what we are standing for in South African society today is the idea of us standing for a just and a livable South Africa. And we believe that such a slogan affirms a positive solidarity. So it's not negative in the sense we're against, but we are for something. And secondly, it stands for this broader conception of fighting injustice. And of course, it's about a platform with systemic alternatives. We have answers, comrades. The charter was developed by movements, and those movements like waste pickers who talk about zero waste, trade unions who talk about climate jobs, etc. These are answers that need to be mainstream. The time has come. We have a framework for accountability. As I said, as an anti-party movement, we want to break the divide between parliament and society. And so these are just some of the bullet points from our strategic perspective document. We expect our activists who go into parliament, maybe 3, 4, we're thinking about a few activists as per the tactic. They basically, raise the alarm bells on the urgencies of climate science, the 2034 moment, if you like, which is our 2024 moment. They work with us on the outside at the gates of parliament. We block every attempt in that parliament to push through carbon capitalism. We spotlight deep just transition work at the base of society. We build a consensus for a people and worker-driven climate justice deal and democratic climate emergency state. In other words, if we have a presence in parliament, we could call for a national convention in this country and bring all the parties and all the progressive forces in this country to start hammering out this climate justice deal and rethinking the state. Again, these are cutting-edge ideas. Even in academia, we are an impasse in terms of state theory. But I think in the movement process that we've been working on, we are making a breakthrough on something very fresh and very different. So I don't want to belabor that point, but the point is this, is that we don't see people voting and then, of course, parliamentarians going to parliament and then they go on and do their own thing. We expect our representatives to work shoulder to shoulder with us, and we work with them. There's 3 phases envisaged in this campaign. From now till January, securing registration and qualification for the elections. We must underline that the court case around independence and signatures was a major confusion for many, many months. We've been trying to get answers from the IEC on what we need to do, and it hasn't been easy. But what seems to be emerging is that we might need 1,000 signatures for the deed of foundation and maybe 1,000 signatures to contest, or maybe not. We've been talking to the IEC. They will be putting out a set of regulations by next week, which will clarify this issue. We've been busy collecting signatures so that we don't have a false debate. And also it's all time sensitive so that we keep our options alive. We'll have to pay 5,000, and of course, to qualify for the elections, 300,000. And so we need to push very hard in this first phase from now till the end of January to get the signatures, to get the money in. In our debates in the CJCM, we realized there aren't donors with bags of money wanting to fund climate politics. And some people will give money for an election because it's an election. So there's something very specific about that moment that we can use to crowdsource and leverage popular support for funding. So that's the first kind of sort of phase of the campaign and point of contact. The second phase of the campaign is February, where we introduce the CJCM electoral platform, as Awande has mentioned. I almost called him Alende. Awande mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work on translating the charter into policies. We now have worked on all 14 alternatives in the charter, and we have some pretty deep thinking around things. For example, we recognize that we can create millions of climate jobs in South Africa, whether it's dredging rivers and ensuring that they do not become climate risks, whether it's keeping biodiversity systems robust, whether it's a national firefighting service, whether it's lifelong training centers, whether it's clean energy, public transport. I mean, I can go on. There's millions of climate jobs we can create in this country, which basically addresses the structural unemployment problem. We want to introduce our candidates. As I said, we're not talking about taking over power here. We are talking about anywhere between 3 to 10 candidates coming from our ranks, tried and tested activists. We want to target the flashpoints, the constituencies and spatial areas for support. This will be the second round of grassroots and media contact. And phase 3 from March till the elections will be both negative and positive messages, and our third round of grassroots and media contact. What we're trying to achieve with the 3 phases of the campaign is a tipping point. In other words, we want our presence to reach a point where it's noticeable. The gaze of society is in our direction as well. Of course, it's crazy out there, but again, there's no science to an election campaign, but if you use some tried and tested tactics, you can definitely land in society. Your message can land in society. And so phase 1 is really about these requirements. We are, as I said, busy collecting signatures, and we'll be calling on you for help based on our resolution tonight. This is phase 1, and we'll also be repurposing on our web page, again, based on our deliberations tonight. We'll be putting on a tab for donations, for public donations. We'll be putting on a tab to get volunteers. And we really want to kind of crowd all of that in during December and January using digital technology and so on, online technology, and some face-to-face work. Phase 2 is about, as I said, presenting a platform, and our message around, giving democracy back to the people and workers, and basically messages like, together, let's prepare for the next drought. Together, let's prepare for the next extreme storm. And again, to position these posters in communities that have had climate impacts, who have lived through it, who know the pain of this, and who know the need for us to act on this. And we've seen this in our activism, comrades, over the years. In drought-affected communities and so on. And then phase 3 is negative and positive messaging, where we're talking about the failures that we are faced with as a society, but also talking about solutions. So kind of getting that messaging, kind of working on real problems that people are facing, but connecting it up to systemic solutions. Essentially, the campaign will be coordinated through our national coordinating committee, which will give overall direction. It's meeting tomorrow. So tonight's deliberation, I mean, this is not a formal structure, but we've been having deep conversation with our core activists. We felt it was important to open the ranks and see who else has a position, a perspective, and what do people think. But from here, we want to take this outcome into our NCC tomorrow. And basically, if you give us a go-ahead, we're going to go into campaign mode. We'll set up a national elections campaign structure, which will meet weekly. Coming out of this meeting, we want to convene immediately a volunteer meeting next week. And of course, we want to get our infrastructure in place. Provincial and local campaign structures as well. And then, of course, key planning and initiation tasks in our document, which I'm not going to bother you with. And then finally, so one of the questions we've been grappling with to clarify the fact that we're not a party is, what do we do after the elections moment? We're convinced if we fight this election, we'll come out stronger. We'll get the climate emergency message into the mainstream. If we get election representatives in parliament, that's a bonus, and it'll be a great leverage to have. But even and despite that, we will continue doing our work on the ground. If we are in this parliament and we are faced with a coalition scenario, we are basically saying that we'll only give conditional support to a coalition. Such a coalition must convene an emergency sitting of parliament to deliberate on the urgencies of climate science and the state of preparedness of the country. 2024 is our 2034 moment to prepare the country. They must stop all offshore oil and gas extraction. They must commit to a national convention of parties and civil society on a climate justice deal for South Africa, co-convened with us. They must commit to a new IRP, an integrated resource plan, which will be renewable energy heavy and phase out coal and gas rapidly to achieve a low and zero carbon energy system, consistent with pulling us back down to 50 parts per million. We will continue resisting oil and gas from below. We will consolidate our election campaign structures into formal CJCM structures. We will advance our umbrella campaign to accelerate the deep just transition now in communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state. We will deepen our relationship with allies. Our South African food sovereignty campaign is 10 years old next year, and we'll be taking that into various communities. We will build institutional capacity to advance our 4 strategies, our political program, and democratic systemic reforms from below. So that's it, comrades. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Comrade Vish and Comrade Awande, for your presentation. We are now going to open the platform for comments, questions from the comrades. Over to you, comrades. Anyone wants to start? You're more than welcome, comrades, to raise your views about both presentation. Comments. I don't see any hand, comrade. Any comments?
Comrades,
Okay.
just to help Comrade Ruth. Yes, Rashida's
Comrade
hand.
Rashida.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can see Comrade Rashida. Comrade Rashida.
Thank you, Comrade Ruth. I just want to tell, this platform that if we don't wake up now, as a representative and a leader in the informal economy of South Africa, we can see the economic decline that is already there. Our informal traders are struggling, suffering, and when it becomes weather, the inclement weather, whether there's storms or whether there's extreme heat, we also find ourselves being challenged and that we cannot survive. It is imperative that we realize the importance and our, activation of this climate justice movement as a political party, to have our voices heard in Parliament. And as an activist within the informal sector and part of the climate justice movement, I 100% support you, Comrade Vish, in the attempts of doing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Rashida. Any other comment? Questions? I don't see any other hand, comrades. Oh,
There's a
Comrade
hand from
Dylan? Yeah, Comrade Dylan.
Thanks, comrades. Just a question that popped up during my discussion around CGM partaking in the election. What about the option of co-opting independents? Has that been explored? Because that will probably take a lot less energy and galvanizing in terms of election, which personally I'm in full support of. So that's just a question thrown out there. Thanks.
Okay. Any response? Comrade Vish?
I wonder if
Comrade Dawde?
feel free to come in as well. I'll just add 1 or 2 points. I think, Comrade Delwyn, I mean, the way some of these political parties are approaching independence, they see them as, you know, a Trojan horse, an attempt to kind of, once the election happens, is kind of pull them closer to them. And they're seeing this in narrow electoralist terms, of course. I mean, for us, you know, something like this becomes a reality if we're in parliament, and it's something we're going to have to think about. But I think, you know, as it stands right now on the political field, it doesn't make sense to reach out to anyone. I mean, it's the nature of an elections moment. Everybody has to test themselves. You got to go to an electorate. You got to basically present your message, and you got to see what happens. It's only after an election, when the ballots are counted and the numbers are there, do you know how much of influence, how much of power, whatever you have at that level. So I think that's something we must think about. I think, you know, it's too hasty. The last point I'll make is that I think if we don't get the climate message, the climate emergency message through clearly, because this is the moment, we can't be, you know, we don't know what baggage these independents bring. And by the way, not all of them are like a glorious saints. Who knows who's paying for them? Who knows what agendas they are carrying, etc. So for now, comrades, if we do this, we're going to have to be very, very clear about amplifying what we stand for in society. That's why I put out those posters and where we put that message in society. I mean, the idea is to use the electoral moment to make it a climate justice moment, to use the electoral moment to talk climate politics, to use the electoral moment to put the climate emergency on the ballot. I think this is what's exciting about how we're trying to approach it. So yes, I mean, you know, we're not seeking to be the next big opposition and so on. We are trying to bring a narrative to the heart of South African politics as highly committed, serious climate activists. And this is a moment where we can try and do this. I don't know if Awande wants to add.
So just to pick up on the point that Vish made about also using this moment to bring climate justice politics to the mainstream and to put it there on the list of options of things that are being sought out and being fought for in this election. I think it's also important to consider with regards to the independence question is that there's also a different kind of interaction that could take place in working from that perspective to trying to achieve these goals. And that's that independent candidates act as, you know, a kind of party of one. So the person who is partaking in the election as an independent also has a range of other kind of groups or constituencies that they're trying to galvanize to put them in position to being in parliament as this party of one. So a thing that can happen instead of us actually being able to put our perspective on the menu with regards to what people should be thinking about in an elections moment is that we end up playing a role of just facilitating a legitimization process of this person's campaign to say that, oh, because we're there and we're working with them, then this person is representative of climate justice struggle. So there's a lack of accountability also in terms of how then if you work with certain independents who have campaigns that are already moving, campaigns which are already subject to certain funding requirements and things of that nature, which we're only meeting at this point right now, how then do we ensure and protect the kind of, you know, validity and, you know, the purity, so to speak, of the message that we're trying to bring forward. Because once we've given that support, then there's no kind of mechanism for us to be able to, materially make sure that that is then, transformed into this candidate working in that way of bringing our climate justice politics into the mainstream. So I think there are too many holes with regards to how do we protect ourselves, how do we protect our work and our activism in that kind of process. And I think there's a similar thing to be said also about some of these newer small parties also that have popped up, or some of the other small parties that have already existed, is that there's just a gap in the ability for us to be able to protect our work up to this point as climate justice activists, and also kind of protect the integrity of our message, by working with them in this way, because there's not many options in how we have, a role of having agency in how our message is also put across, because this person would be the face of the campaign. So I think it kind of also diverts from some of the things we're speaking about in being, an anti-party movement, and also not being, electoralist for electoral sake, because you end up having to play some of those games, I believe.
Okay. Thank you, comrades. More comments? Comrade Gosinati? Unmute yourself, Comrade Gosinati.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. Firstly, I would like to applaud the work that has been done by the CJCM and the presentations we just received from Awande and Vish. On climate emergency, I think the research you have done, it's marvelous. I mean, if you were to look at it, that in the next 10 years, 63% of South Africans are on a climate a vulnerable kind of a situation. And if we were looking at the climate processes that are currently happening at the national level, so what I want to clarity on, you've mentioned the work that is being done by the PCC, and while speaking on climate emergency, you've spoken that what is needed right now is a convention on a convention on climate emergency. So can you please maybe elaborate on that, to maybe clarify as to how on the setup of the convention, because the PCC is doing the work is doing. I'm not sure whether the pace and the manner they are doing it, they are on the right line. So can you please maybe try to clarify that this convention, because I get a sense that maybe it will be a substitute to the PCC if we are making it into the political space, or maybe in government, as you're suggesting or proposing right now. So can I just get a clarity on the convention? It's kind of set up in the processes and procedures that are there in place to deal with this climate emergency you've been uttering to. Thank you.
Comrade Ruth, can I start?
Yes, come in, my leader.
And definitely Awande will add to this, because he's been leading our work on this. So Comrade, just a few introductory points, and then Awande will add more substance to this. I think the first thing is how we understand the climate crisis, comrades. And I've been saying it and I'm repeating it. The climate crisis, comrades, is not a normal problem. It's not a problem that can be solved by a few technocrats sitting in a commission. It's not even a problem that can be solved by climate scientists. Climate scientists can help us understand it, but they cannot solve this problem. It cannot be solved just by government in its routine operations. Because what is the climate crisis, comrades? The climate crisis is a rupture in the Earth system, okay? It is propelling us into a new state of the Earth. We are leaving behind 11,000 years of a relatively stable climate. We are going into an unknown world of serious danger, risk, and harm. That's what the climate crisis is. It threatens all of us. And so what that means, comrades, is that you got to have a very different politics around this. You got to have a mass democratic politics around it. Society has to own it. They have to own the problem. They have to own the solutions. That's what we are all about. So that's the first thing. The Presidential Climate Commission is not about that, comrades. They think that doing a few technocratic exercises on the side and mainstreaming some conversations and, of course, having the same politicians lead us on this is going to solve this problem. It's not. The second point to make is the way they understand the science. The Presidential Climate Commission does not take the urgencies of the science seriously. We took to Parliament a document prepared by the leading climate scientists in the country, and my colleagues at Wits University. And they highlighted that we are heating at twice the global average. That became something that was even picked up even by the Minister of Environment and so on. But we wanted Parliament to debate this document, and they did not. The point about us heating at twice the global average, comrades, is that the moment we overshoot 1.5 globally at 3 degrees, it's going to have dramatic impacts on our socio-ecological systems. My climate science colleagues have already warned us that our food systems are going to be in extreme stress. Our water systems are going to be in extreme stress, okay? So this is not just some linear gradual thing, i.e. the COP. You know, you cut by 45% by 2030, and by 2050, you suddenly have what they call net zero. It's not such a linear process. For some of us on the planet and regions and countries, we are going to be experiencing the extremes way before, and it's already started, okay? So being one of 10 hotspots, we are sitting in a very dangerous place as a country, okay? So they don't take that on board. The last point I'll make, and I one day we'll take this further, is that consistent with what I've been arguing, we need a framework that can build a new climate emergency social contract in our society, okay? Where everyone owns this problem in workplaces, in communities, in sectors, and the state. We don't have a social contract anymore. The social contract we had in this country in the early rainbow moment and so on, that's all gone, okay? It's a deeply polarized country. It's tearing itself apart. We need to build a consensus that can solve the poly crisis. And that's what this framework is about. But Awande can say way more than me.
Comrade Awande.
Thank you, Chair. So as Vish said, the climate crisis is not a normal crisis. And I think that part of the responsibility of mainstreaming, climate emergency politics is also to speak, as I was saying when I was presenting on, the wider issues of the failure of governance on dealing with the problems of the climate, the poly crisis, because all these things are intertwined. And the way in which certain bodies and the way in which our government has gone about this problem is that it's another issue to tick off in line with some of the existing policy agenda. And we've seen that the existing policy agenda is already failing to deal with, the historic crises that we face, but it's also, woefully ill-equipped to deal with the growing poly crisis also, and the growing problems also that have been added on top of the crises and failures that they've felt to deal with. So the PCC is an example of that. It's also an example of that in its undemocratic aspect in terms of its formation. So there's a lot of aspects of how it's being done right now and the way in which we're thinking around the problem, or politics in our country is thought about the problem, that we'd have to break away from. So part of that national convention is, it's a national convention to sit and think around and discuss a climate justice deal for South Africa. So as Vish was saying, we don't have a social contract in this country, and a climate justice deal would be a climate emergency social contract. So that really would force all these different parties and all these different players to sit down and think tangibly with regards to what that means to transform our society completely in line with the vision of the Charter, to be able to meet the challenge of this crisis, but to also deal with these historical crises that has brought us to this point. So that's part of what the work of the convention would be, but it's also seen in all our policy work also. So the policy work is also a kind of slice of all the different aspects that would come together to form the whole. And the climate justice deal documents and the climate justice deal work that we've been working on and that we'll release with all the other policies also is a holistic kind of capturing of what that perspective is and what would have to come out of such a convention in terms of the scale of transformation that we're speaking about from the national level, but also at the community and grassroots level. So it's a tangible vision of what it means and what it looks like to have a deep, just transition. So we're not just talking about accelerating the deep, just transition, but a transition to what is very important. So that's part of the process in terms of what we're speaking about. And I think that's fundamentally part of the problem with regards to where we are in the political space right now, with regards to not having proper representation and space for climate justice politics of this level, of this maturity being included in the national space, is that, you know, things of transitions and the climate crisis have become mainstream talking points, but there's also a kind of lack of depth with regards to what they ultimately account to and what they're leading us to. So this is just another part of our work. It's not anything new in terms of what the Charter and the movement set out to do from the beginning, which is to fundamentally transform our state. And that's in the Charter from, you know, the actual early days before we even embarked on this work of a climate justice deal. So the climate justice deal and the climate emergency social contract is the next step in making that tangible and giving our society the kind of infrastructure that we need in terms of, you know, social, but also policy infrastructure that we require to meet the crisis the way in which we believe and has been laid out in the Charter. So I hope that's also clear.
Okay. Thank you so much, Comrade Tawanda and Comrade Vish. Those were the hands and the comments that Comrades has actually made. Comrades, can I get a sense that in light of what has been presented and that Comrades, I think Comrade Roshida was explicit in terms of the support of the entire process. There are a number of faces that are being outlined, that if Comrades are not showing any objection in relation to our approach, we are going to request assistance, especially in relation to the first phase of the 1,000 signatures, that we are in a process of consolidating the list for 1,000 signatures that are required between now and January. There is a list that we are going to share, Comrades, or perhaps we can even ask a Comrade, let me just see the comment on the chat. Okay. I'm not too sure, Comrade Awande, will it be proper if we can share that list on the chat box, or maybe we allow Comrades to request for the list? I don't know how should.
I think it would be better that we ask for Comrades to request a link, which we'll put on our site for them to be able to fill out and share to distribute for support. That way, it'll be a bit more streamlined and clear, easier for us to manage.
Yeah, I think we cannot just leave it open-ended because of it's needed by January. I'm not too sure whether it's the end of January or beginning of January. Perhaps if you can also indicate by when can the comrades at least provide us with the
Preferably by beginning of Jan. As the phase plans spoke there that policy would be coming out by start of Feb, so beginning of Jan, so we can begin with the next phases.
Okay. No, thank you so much in relation to that. I think there's a question from Comrade Marjorie. Is one approach to challenge all the civil society organization participating? I think that was just the comment. Okay. And then in relation to the other phases, especially when it comes to, I think Comrade Vish spoke about having different platforms where we'll be meeting almost weekly. Is it something that the NCC perhaps can come up with the nitty-gritties of it? Or how do you think it can be approached, Comrade Vish?
So Comrade Ruth, I mean, I just want to also just say something to Comrade Marjorie's point. So Comrade Marjorie, I mean, the way we've tried to position the charter process, we've tried to call the bluff of the political elite in South Africa. When we went to Parliament with the charter in 2020, we asked the Speaker's office to convene an online debate. And we invited all the parties to come because we were presenting also the climate science document. And none of the big three parties came. None of the big three parties even sent any apology. Those that came, the smaller ones, they had no clue about what we were talking about, etc. Again, reflecting the weakness of leadership. When we went back to the gates of Parliament in 2021 with the fire engine, and again, all they could tell us, well, we've sent a delegation to the COP and the problem is being solved. That's the level of consciousness that you are dealing with. Now, the other political parties, I mean, all wannabes and so on, I don't see why we should go and paint them with the climate emergency brush, basically. They're not there on their own, which is telling us a lot already, okay? They're not serious about this. And that is why we've been grappling with this. It's time to move beyond performative politics and fake politics. It's time to have a truthful politics, a politics that's grounded in science, that's grounded in the realities of what we are living. And we need to talk that truth. And I get very, very frustrated with the world we're living in because it's a post-truth world. We need to reaffirm truth. And we need to bring it into politics. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. But I think, Comrade Ruth, in terms of how we proceed, I mean, I think that it's important that, you know, we carry everyone. And I'm not sure, I mean, how long further you want to go with the meeting, but I think the NCC tomorrow is very, very important. It will have to now look at this document we've developed. They'll have to look at the different phases. They'll have to look at the key tasks. There's various tasks there that have to be now operationalized. Like, for instance, we need a mapping of where the key flashpoint struggles are. We know, for example, offshore oil and gas resistance is there. We're part of it. We need to map those communities. We need to figure out where the arterial roads are and so on. In cities and towns, the key ones that we want to target. So there's a list of tasks in the document. So again, we are not running around like headless chickens. We have a very, very focused approach to what we are doing. It's laser sharp, it's clear. We use our limited resources. We use our limited capacity to have some kind of high impact. I think the second thing that's very, very crucial is just thinking around this phase that we are in, sort of pushing the donations very hard. We're going to be purposing the webpage, pushing the volunteer message very hard. and getting some kind of first contact where we get the CJCM kind of presence in some public spaces, etc. As part of this. I think that has to also be owned by the NCC. And you have to also then constitute the National Elections Campaign Subcommittee made up of representatives from provinces and so on and so on. So that's kind of work that has to happen tomorrow. I don't know how much longer you want to go with the meeting, Comrade Ruth.
I think we are almost towards the end of the meeting. Comrade, I think you've just wrapped it up in terms of the way forward. And the NCC of tomorrow, they will have to process some of the issues coming out of this discussion. And of course, there will be feedback session. And we are mindful of the fact that there are provincial PCCs, provincial committees, that various organizations are participating in the platform, and information will be shared in those platforms. So I think in terms of the way forward, this is how we need to wrap it up, unless if there's someone who wants to make an addition in relation to the way forward. Comrade Vish?
Yeah. Comrade Lydia had to leave because of technical problems, but she and I had a discussion because she'll be leading this and she was going to announce this anyway. So she's basically proposing that next week, the 14th of December, we have another online national campaign, elections campaign meeting with volunteers and so on. So we kicked that off. So that's next week, the 14th, probably around the same time. But the NCC can figure out the modalities of this. We then have another volunteers meeting on the 16th of January, again online, and they can figure out the modalities of this. She was going to basically introduce herself as our national campaign secretary, ready to kind of hit the ground. So these are kind of dates she wanted to put into the conversation. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Okay. No, I think this brings us to the end of our meeting, and let me take this opportunity, Comrade, and thank all of us in attending this meeting. And hopefully, comrades, that you're going to have more meeting and the participation of comrades. We are really looking forward for more participation and robust engagement, so that we can make it the point that we change the narrative. And it has been said, comrade, that we cannot just sit back and allow the ANC government to speak on our behalf. I mean, they failed us. It has been said that, comrade, that they failed us. So we need to make it a point that we stand up and we change the narrative. Thank you so much, comrade. Let's enjoy the rest of our evening. Thank you,
Thank you.
comrade. Thanks.
Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. Good night to everyone.